about the music, it's about the kind of lifestyle we live. I was amazed when David decided he wanted to make a soul album, and he called me in August '74 to tell me the news. We're making it in Philadelphia using musicians from MFSB, and we're recording it in Sigma Sound. The studio is legendary, and he got no argument from me. Having been a soul and R&B fan since he was a teenager, I knew David had it in him. The thing is, Tony, we've started making demos already, so you'll need to be on a plane tomorrow. As soon as I arrived from London, I rushed straight to the studio to be greeted by a very skinny David, who introduced me to his band, which none of were members of the MFSB. They were keyboard player Mike Garson, drummer Andy Newmark, bassist Willie Weeks, and saxophonist David Sanborn. Shortly after I arrived, David's new guitarist, Carlos Alomar, arrived, his Gibson 355 in one hand and his small Fender amp in the other. With Carlos was his wife, Robin Clark, and their friend from the Bronx, a very young Luther Vandross. The idea was for them to try out as backing singers. I was shown in the control room and asked, "Who's the engineer?" The studio's chief engineer, Carl Perullo, said, "You are," with a very dejected look on his face. At that time in America, they recorded flat with no processing, believing that it could all be fixed in the mix. David would have none of this, so I rolled up my sleeves and started engineering British style. On my very first day, suffering from acute jet lag, we were still able to get a final version of the song Young Americans on tape. From then on, the sessions were great due to the wonderfully talented and professional players. Unfortunately, David was showing up later and later to the sessions. He had gotten into the habit of recording very late and sometimes propped himself up with a couple of toots. I had already been taking Charlie off and on for several years, but I found myself taking more and more to deal with my jet lag and David's late arrivals. I also liked it very much. The only time this became a strain on me was when I had to start going into the studio early to do overdubs with Garson, Alomar, and Sanborn. We'd work all day, and then David would appear at 11 p.m. and listen to the day's work, usually approving of what we'd done. On one such day, I was really suffering from sleep deprivation when David arrived at 1 a.m. "I want to do some vocals now." Of course, I complied, but around 10 a.m., cocaine was no longer an option for me. I had run out of every ounce of energy I had left. After yet another vocal take, I said, "David, I can't stay awake any longer." "Well, I'll finish up with Carl. You can take my limo back to the hotel," he said with some disappointment in his voice. It was a beautiful, warm October morning, and the limo slowly made its way through the busy traffic towards the Hotel Berkeley in Rittenhouse Square. As I watched the faces of the cheerful Philadelphians cross at the lights, I realized that I was about to have a heart attack. My chest was pounding as if it was going to explode. I lay as still as possible, looking at the faces in the crowd behind my smoke glass windows, thinking, "This is the last thing I'm going to see. I'm about to die." I was afraid that if I asked the driver to take me to a hospital, I would be arrested and there would be a raid on the studio. I remember that I had a bottle of Mogadon sleeping pills in my hotel room. I thought if I could only reach them in time and take some, my heart would slow down. That was just what I did when I arrived at the hotel several minutes later. I took the elevator to my room, opened the bottle, and swallowed 12 pills at once with a glass of water. And I waited. My pulse began to slow down within minutes, and my chest stopped pounding. After about 10 minutes, I started to slip into unconsciousness, and I wasn't quite sure if I took an overdose, but somehow I wasn't bothered anymore. This is funny. I woke up many hours later and realized I had barely survived with the use of my so-called street smarts. Now, on a lighter side, I instigated a visit of one of David's idols to the studio. One day before going to work, I was listening to WMMR Rock Radio, and the DJ, Ed Shockey, let's hear it for MMR. Ed Shockey announced that Bruce Springsteen, a very young Bruce Springsteen, had just visited his studio with a cassette of his latest songs. David loves Springsteen's music and played his first album to me. We had just recorded a cover of Springsteen's It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City. I called the station and spoke to Shockey off the air and told him that he had to get Springsteen to the studio to meet David and to hear the song. "That's cool," said Shockey, "but the problem is Springsteen lives in a caravan and he could be parked along the highway of anywhere in the tri-state area." Undaunted, he went in search of him and brought him to the studio that evening. Springsteen was very shy and seemed to be bewildered as to why anyone would want to record one of his songs. After that, we went to New York City to do further work on the album at the Hit Factory with Harry Maslin, the engineer. One day, as I was working at the Hit Factory alone, David phoned me. "John Lennon's coming to my suite at the hotel tonight, and it would be great if you could be there and buffer the meeting between us." As we spoke, David seemed to be very nervous. I, on the other hand, could not wait to meet Lennon. I arrived at about 11 p.m., and having knocked on the door, there was no reply for a few minutes. I heard a lot of shuffling going on before I heard a voice I didn't recognize say, "Who is it?" Then, when I identified myself, Neil Aspinall, the former Beatles roadie and now an Apple executive, opened the door. As I walked in, I looked to my left to see John Lennon emerging from the bathroom with a young Asian girl. I later found out she was May Pang. The four of us walked into the huge living room, and there was David sitting on the floor next to a pretty Hispanic girl nursing a Himalayan peak of white powder. Lennon and Pang were hiding in the bathroom as they thought I might have been the police. There was coke around, and John didn't want to be implicated. Within minutes, everything was mellow, and we were all partaking in the twin pillars of rock and roll camaraderie, cognac and coke. David was shy and avoiding Lennon. He just sat on the floor drawing on a large sketch pad. The Hispanic girl never said a word, and she was never introduced. I turned to Lennon and said, "If you don't mind, John, I have about 100 questions I'd like to ask you." He turned out to be very charming and replied, "I don't mind, mate." He said, "Mate." "I don't mind, mate, if I have the answers." I asked him with technical curiosity lots of questions about Beatles recordings, including the fingering of the opening chord of A Hard Day's Night. I was very fucking cunty. Those were the two dirty words. I'll see my priest tomorrow. After John and I had talked for hours, he decided to break the ice with David. "Hey, David, do you have another one of those sketch pads?" "Certainly." David separated the leaves in half and gave John a bunch of pages and a pencil. They then entered into a fun sketching contest, each drawing rapid caricatures of each other. This finally drew them into conversation. I noticed that May Pang visibly disapproved of John's drinking and coke-taking. Her stern expression never changed. Eventually, everyone in the room finally got into a dismally dark conversation about what does it all mean, it being life, which left us all staring dejectedly at the floor. We were not helped by the dwindling effects of the cognac and coke. Finally, at around 10 a.m., Lennon felt it was safe to leave. His reason being that if he left in broad daylight, he would not be targeted by the cops. He feared he'd be arrested, the police would plant drugs on him, and he'd be deported before he could get his U.S. green card. I left shortly afterwards and returned to David's suite around 4 p.m. that afternoon to pick him up and go to the studio. David was still sitting in the same spot by the coffee table with the Hispanic lady still sat beside him. The Himalayan peak was now reduced to several grains of sand. "Are you coming to the studio with me, David?" "No, I think I'm going to bed now."